The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author Rick Wilson on his new book, Everything Trump Touches Dies, a Republican strategist gets real about the worst president ever. Plus, Bill Press with NBC's Alex Seitz-Wald on what's next in Florida's race for governor. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The presidency of Donald Trump has brought discord to a party known for its political discipline, as critics within the GOP take aim at a president they feel is destroying their party. Among them is Rick Wilson. Never one to mince words, his new book is a scathing critique of Donald Trump. And we say hello to Rick Wilson, Republican political strategist and author of Everything Trump Touches Dies, a Republican strategist gets real about the worst president ever. Rick Wilson, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And our pleasure to have you with us. And we should point out, you were one of the original Never Trumpers. When did you first realize the damage this candidate could do?
My sort of revelatory moment with Donald Trump and what he would do to the Republican Party happened sometime in the spring of 2015 when the rumors of Trump's desire to get in the race started to surface. And I've worked in Republican politics for nigh on 30 years now, and I realized that the showmanship, the reality TV nature of Donald Trump, the professional wrestling aspect of it, could combine with the power that Fox News has over the Republican electorate and turn this into something that departed from all the conservative principles that I'd ever worked for, and turn it into something hideous. And I think we're seeing that prediction pay out every day, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we can debate for hours about why he won. But from your perspective, as a Republican strategist and committed conservative, how did the party itself let this happen?
Well, this is partly why I wrote my book, to describe the moral and political and intellectual collapse of the Republican Party and the conservative movement in the wake of the rise of Trump. And I think there are a couple of big answers and a couple of small answers. The way we let it happen was that the leadership inside the party, in the form of Reince Priebus and others, completely underestimated the impact that allowing Trump to continue to commit these excesses and continuing to behave in the way he did would build up a vicious cycle of news coverage that eventually blotted out the sun for every other candidate. And eventually led to everyone else in that giant field of serious people getting not just a half or a third or a quarter, but fractions of a % of the coverage Trump was getting. So the combination of a news ecosystem that was fundamentally broken, Trump's continued and loud attacks became great news fodder. You had the Fox News machine, which, it speaks very directly to 90 million households every day. And they were giving, by midway through the race, there was no other candidate in the race with that. You had a large infrastructure of grifters, hucksters, scumbags, weirdos, profiteers, etc., around the Trump movement, all of whom were part of that professional evangelical and professional populist class that we've seen emerge in the country, who really wanted a guy they could easily manipulate and could push towards their agenda items. Steve Bannon is a good case in point on that. This is a guy who has a clear ideology. Trump has no clear ideology except his own ego. But Bannon and the rest of these guys very much saw that they could use him as a vector and rely on some of his baser instincts to carry forth things that they know they couldn't sell because they were too egregiously racist or egregiously xenophobic or egregiously just cruel in a broader sense. So, that collapse inside of the GOP, and not killing off this horrible virus early in the process, is what led us to this to the pass we're at today.
Mm-hmm. How big a factor do you think was race in the election of Donald Trump?
Well, this is the thing that can, for all the tough talk from Republicans about how Trump has let them be the party of real talk and the party of the real America, and as much as Trump's excusers want to say, oh, it was about economic insecurity and it was about elites in Washington, an awful lot of it, at the end of the day, with an awful lot of folks, redounded to a very ugly final message, which was Donald Trump is the avatar against the brown people who make us scared. And I will say this, there's a fairly long chapter in the book, and going through the history of Republicans and race, good and bad, okay? Good and bad. But we have never had a president in this country in our lifetimes who was as assertively racially dog whistling as this man. And I think race was a meaningful factor with a lot of folks. And I've had to say this a million times, and I mean it. Not every Trump supporter is a xenophobic, racist jerk, but every single xenophobic, racist jerk both is a Trump supporter, and they believe that Donald Trump has given them permission now to articulate their hatred of people who don't look like them, and given them permission now to engage in both political and governmental behavior that is explicitly informed by race or by religion.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Rick Wilson, Republican political strategist, author of Everything Trump Touches Dies, a Republican strategist gets real about the worst president ever. Rick, we have now gone past electing to enabling, and you target many actors in that role. For example, how are social conservatives enabling Donald Trump?
Well, look, social conservatives for many, many years told people that we have a strict moral code and that our moral code of evangelical Christianity must be reflected in our national political life. And that if candidates want the support of evangelicals and if candidates want the support of social conservatives, then they have to not only have certain policy beliefs, but they also have to have certain behavioral traits and personal traits that show that they live those beliefs and show that they live those principles. And what we've seen is that Donald Trump has a get out of jail free card from social conservatives on every single issue. And I hate to agree with Ann Coulter on something, but she framed it out in a way that I think that really turned out to be accurate. She said, if Donald Trump will do this immigration plan, he could do an abortion on the front lawn of the White House and nobody will care. Well, she was kind of right. And they don't care what Trump does or is, as long as they're getting judges that they think are going to give them the outcomes that they cannot win at the ballot box or in society. And so as a Republican strategist and ad maker for a long time, I've worked all over the country. Okay. And so I've worked to elect Republicans in blue states and big cities. I did Rudy Giuliani's mayor's race in New York. I elected a Democrat or a Republican governor in Democratic Vermont 4 times. And I've been around the block in a lot of places across the country where if you came up with a cookie cutter Republican candidate in those places, who had to take orders from central command and be rigidly pro-life or rigidly pro-Second Amendment, you weren't going to win in that place. You weren't going to do it. You couldn't close the deal. Well, evangelicals for years lost their damn minds about it. How dare you try to elect somebody who isn't perfect? Well, they have now set a new standard and have a new principle involved here, which is as long as we get the judges we want to do the things that we want to do socially, we're all good. And my difficulty with some of this is that I don't think that a political monoculture is a good thing broadly, and B, as a conservative and a constitutionalist, I don't believe that social engineering on the right is any more meritorious than social engineering on the left. So I don't think it's the government's business to tell people who can get married to who. If you're consenting adults, competent consenting adults, it's not the government's job to tell you can't get married to somebody. They don't believe that, though. They don't believe in the conservative principle of limited government power when it comes to gay marriage, for instance, which I find as a sort of libertarian inflected conservative to be ridiculous. But now they've got a guy who says, "I'll do it for you. I'll take care of it for you." Right. So I think that's an area, by the way, of where the left and the right in this country right now have a lot more. There are a lot more folks in the middle on that question than almost anything else. And I've often just wondered at the shocking desire of these guys to manipulate the judicial system in order to game an outcome where society has absolutely made up its mind. We're okay with gay marriage. We're okay with gay people in our society. It's not perfect. We're not all there yet in terms of all the questions of equality, but the fraction of people right now who believe that gay marriage should be banned by the government and that gay adoptions and so on should be banned by the government is gratifyingly small. But there are people that are supporting Trump because they believe that he will take those steps.
Well, and it's amazing to me and yet it holds so much sway. With it being such a small amount of the population that believes that, and yet it has a lot of power.
We started out in the world where you had in the Republican Party, the three big legs of the stool. You had social conservatives, you had economic conservatives, and the folks who were motivated by free markets, lower taxes, etc. And you had national security folks. So the current Republican Party consists of Donald Trump and social conservatives. The economic conservatives have either abandoned that principle completely, or there's nothing they can do right now to tighten, budgetary discipline or anything like that. And the national security conservatives are watching the president mortgage the country to Russia. So the SoCons are getting what they wanted. They're the winners in this contest so far.
Sure. Now that Donald Trump has been in office for a year and a half, what kind of impact has this had on the Republican Party and the conservative movement?
Well, there is no Republican Party to speak of today. It is a one-man show. It is a personality-driven, top-down. The word cult is often overused, but we're damn close to that at this point. And the principles that once informed the Republican Party of limited government, of free markets, of free trade, of fiscal discipline, of individual liberty, have all been thrown aside, and it is transformed into the Trumpian nationalist populist party you see today. And with varying degrees of felicity and smoothness. Some of these guys are really embarrassingly bad at this. Some of them are some of them believe it. Most of them don't. They're just faking it. But you can't have a party that changes its ideological bearings 180 degrees on all these major policy areas and still call it a party.
Mm-hmm. Moving beyond Republicans, what concerns you most about President Trump's impact on the nation as a whole?
Well, I think there are three big areas that I find deeply concerning. The first is Donald Trump's affection for a kind of authoritarian, top-down, l'état c'est moi form and style of governance. Republicans objected very, very, very strenuously when Barack Obama was sort of stuck with a Congress that wouldn't do what he wanted, and so he did a lot of governing by executive order. And Republicans threw up their hands and screamed and yelled and said, "Oh, this is awful. We can't do this. This is against our fundamental principles as a republic, and he's a statist." And blah, blah, blah. Well, Donald Trump, saving one tax bill, Donald Trump is governed almost exclusively by executive order. I don't like power to be reposed into the hands of the executive, particularly when the executive is driven by ego, vanity, conflicts, and all the sort of pathologies that define Donald Trump. Because I believe the founders had a genius in their construction of the way this government operated, of three independent and co-equal branches. And we're seeing that completely diminished. The Republicans in Congress have, they act as if they are employees of Trump rather than members of that co-equal branch. And I think there's a great and disturbing set of moral compromises he's made in this country, in terms of Russia, in terms of our role in the world, in terms of his adoption of some of this nationalism and populism that he has, turned into the centerpiece of our foreign policy now, which is to reduce our standing in the world, to reduce our relationships with allies, to break down the institutions that have helped make the world, relatively peaceful and prosperous for generations. I find that incredibly disturbing. And there is a certain degree of Trump that I find, I don't want to say aesthetically disturbing, but I think that a lot of the way he behaves and governs and speaks and communicates and divides us is in the end going to diminish us as a country and to sort of take away some of the hard-won image of this country as a place that, that isn't ideal and not a race or a homeland. I think that he's diminished our ability to be a beacon in the world, very, very strongly diminished it. And because of that, I find that both sad and troubling. And that idea that this is a propositional nation is one that was deeply embedded in our founding and deeply embedded in the arc we've traveled ever since then. But in Donald Trump's case, it's not a propositional nation. He gets to decide what religion is okay. He gets to decide what race or what country or ethnic nationality or ethnic origin is okay. And there are good Americans who kneel when he tells them and don't and stand when he tells them. And there are bad Americans who have thoughts that are opposed to him. I think that the combination of those three big streams is sort of the basic indictment on Trump and his character. Also, he's completely compromised by the Russians. He's crooked as hell.
Yeah, then there's that.
Oh, there's that.
Yeah, right. We're speaking with Rick Wilson, Republican political strategist, author of Everything Trump Touches Dies, a Republican strategist gets real about the worst president ever. Rick, there's no shortage of books now that portray American democracy itself at risk under the sway of an authoritarian ruler. Do you share those concerns?
I do find that the trend lines in the world of Donald Trump are leading us towards some places that as a Western liberal democracy, we ought not go. And I think that there is a combination of forces between Trump's impulsivity and between his desire to have instant obedience and control over people, and his desire to try to treat the country as if the Trumps were a royal family and not just mere residents and employees of the people of America. I find all those things and all that authoritarian, curious behavior on his part. He loves Vladimir Putin. He hates everybody else. He loves Duterte in the Philippines. He hates everybody else. He praises Kim being able to make his people, instantly sit up and obey. All these things combined with the impulsivity and combined with the fact that there is a largely compliant media apparatus that exists every day to say that Donald Trump is the tallest, handsomest, smartest man in the world, and that nothing he does is wrong, and the lack of any congressional oversight and any congressional accountability. I think those combinations, if you're inclined to be an authoritarian asshole and you're suddenly given the tools to do it and no one's going to tell you no, things go wrong quickly.
We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're talking with Rick Wilson, author of Everything Trump Touches Dies. A Republican strategist gets real about the worst president ever. Coming up next, can the Republican Party save itself from Donald Trump? But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Workers of America, rejoice! As our nation celebrates Labor Day with backyard cookouts, fun at the beach, or simply kicking back in a lazy boy and doing several rounds of 12-ounce elbow bends, we can all take comfort in the happy news that our economy is whizzing. Economists tell us that job creation is surging, wages are rising, and consumers are racking up record levels of purchases. What's not to like about all that? Two things. First, the economists' claim about wage growth is a sham, covering up the shame that top corporate executives and major shareholders are grabbing nearly all of the economic gains produced by America's entire workforce. The so-called nominal wage, i.e. the sum that workers see on their paychecks, has risen only 2.7% in the past year, a very mediocre result for the 82% of the labor force who are non-managerial worker bees. Second, that nominal wage is not the worker's real wage, for it doesn't take into account the very real fact that consumer price increases eat up the buying power of people's paychecks. Indeed, while nominal wages are up 2.7% in recent months, the price of everything from gasoline to groceries is up by 2.9%, effectively slapping working families with a wage cut. Sure, the economy is whizzing on the working class. This is Jim Hightower saying, so all the rejoicing on this Labor Day is coming from the gated zip codes of the rich. For example, in the same year that workers took a pay cut, the CEOs of America's 350 largest corporations had an 18% jump in their pay, hauling in an average of $18.9 million each. In a lifetime of labor, the typical American worker would not be paid as much as those honchos took in 1 year. Those few are getting rich enough to air-condition hell, and I think they'd better be pooling their money for that project.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Still with us is Rick Wilson, author of Everything Trump Touches Dies, a Republican strategist gets real about the worst president ever. Rick, after the president's meeting with Vladimir Putin, you wrote a piece in the Daily Beast with this title, Helsinki is Congress's wake-up call. Republicans in the House and Senate must finally hold Trump to account. What are the chances this will actually happen?
Well, the chances after November are a lot better because this Republican Congress is utterly disinterested in anything to do with keeping Donald Trump honest about the Russia situation. They are in fact aggressively attempting to help him navigate out of it. They are aggressively attempting to manipulate and aggressively attempting to sabotage the Mueller investigation and any other investigation and any ability of this country to secure itself against future interference by Russia. So they have abdicated their responsibilities so profoundly and so thoroughly that as a lifelong Republican, I in many ways Trump's behavior was expected. You know, he is a guy who has a predictable set of bad behaviors. What has truly shocked me is the utter, complete abdication of Paul Ryan and other members of the leadership who I know personally, and I know these guys are not the caricature of, the mouth-breathing Trump lover, but they are so afraid of him and so afraid of his base that they have engaged in a pattern of behavior now that, in order to protect them, that is utterly reprehensible in every way. And I don't know how you ever unring that bell as a party. When you're standing up with a man who is assertively destroying the principles your party claims to stand for, and hip deep in a Russian information warfare operation that was set up to divide and diminish this country, and frankly to elect Donald Trump as president, and who is this lavishly corrupt figure that you can't live down. They don't get to walk away from this later and go, yeah, I was just I was just a temporary Trumper. I was just play acting. I was role playing. No, you don't get to do that. So, that's what's been my biggest shock in this thing is that these people who I know publicly and privately who have enormous reservations about Trump, who do not like him as a person, who do not believe he is a good president or a good person or a moral or ethical leader, still go up there, put the red hat on, and pretend that everything's great. And I'm a cynical guy. I've been in a cynical business for a long time. Sorry, I just dropped something on the floor. I apologize. I'll start over. I'm a cynical guy. I've been in a cynical business for a very long time. But it is breathtaking. It is breathtaking what we see every day with members of Congress who understand how dangerous and how corrupt and how utterly wrong this man is, and out of fear of him and fear of his base, and in some cases a sort of opportunistic understanding that they could really, try to leverage themselves as the next Donald Trump, only slightly less, mouth breathing. It is a combination of forces that has made everyone look like the worst possible caricatures of shameless and feckless and cowardly political figures. It's a disaster.
Now, obviously, you are a Republican political strategist, as we've talked about. You've been doing this for a long time. In your view, what does the Republican Party need to do to repair the damage of Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, after World War II in France, the people who had been in the Vichy government collaborating with the Nazis had something called the Épuration Légale, which was this moment of reconciliation and accountability for people who had helped Hitler. Now, a lot of them went to jail. a lot of them lost their property, a lot of them lost their liberty, and a good number of them were hung by the neck. But that moment where you reconcile and you basically have a hard break with the past, and you say, okay, what we have done here is wrong. What we've done here is in some ways, needs a few examples to stand as a warning for the future. So there are going to be people in this party, if you want to save it, and I honestly don't know I honestly don't know that Republicans want to save the party right now. If they want a conservative party, they may have to reboot a new one and make it up from scratch. But but if they want to save the GOP from Trump, if they want to transform it into something that is about limited government, constitutional fealty, fiscal discipline, they're going to have to take the hit. They're going to have to take a hard political shot to the head, and admit what they've done. They're going to have to live down this whole thing that they've engaged in, and that's not easy for people. It's not psychologically easy. It's not politically easy. But the corrective may end up being that the Democrats win a majority, and we finally get some actual accountability on the White House. And they may have to just face it. And I think back about Nixon, and I think there's a relevant case to be made that in 1973 the Republicans were with Nixon to the hilt. They were not going to do anything. They were going to protect him. It was literally called a witch hunt. And by 1974 they realized they were defending a guy who was guilty.
Right.
And in politics, there's nothing worse for the voters. I've seen this over the years. There's almost nothing worse for the voters than lies to cover corruption. Lies to cover corruption make the voters angry as hell. There are a lot of times where the guy will get a reputation as being a scumbag or corrupt or venal, and people will kind of excuse it for a long time. Oh yeah, he's our scumbag. This is Jim Trafficant, writ large, okay? Like, obviously corrupt, but had a kind of lovable rogue nature. Well, in this case, I think there are people who Trump's an asshole, but he's our asshole is a very frequent refrain on the right. And I think that you're going to end up with, as people realize he's not just an asshole, he's a guy who has hidden a lot from us, who has behaved in reprehensible ways, who has compromised this country and our security in really meaningful ways. And when that's exposed, it's harder for the GOP at that point to just sit up and go, it's all fine. It's all good. We're fine. No problem here. Moving on. So,
well,
I volunteered to chair the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Well, as we mentioned at the top, you're one of the leaders of the Never Trump movement of Republicans. How do you envision its future, especially as Donald Trump's polling well with Republican voters?
No, he's not polling well with Republican voters. He's polling wonderfully with Republican voters. But this is like saying that the head of the Flat Earth Society is considered credible by the rest of the members of the Flat Earth Society. A lot of what Donald Trump's doing to the party is shrinking it. So as a pollster, a friend of mine said to me the other day, he goes, yeah, I'm doing more calls to get my Republican samples now. And he thinks that's an early indicator, because people are drifting out of the GOP, or they're suddenly getting soft on saying that they're Republicans. And what that means is the base itself is shrinking in the short term. And that's going to join up with the base itself shrinking in the long term, because there's a demographic reality here that the GOP is facing. It is getting older. It is getting to the point where let me loop back one second. I'll give you a good example. When Rush Limbaugh burst on the scene in the late 80s, mid-late 80s, his audience was about 45 years old. In the 90s, his audience was about 55 years old. In the 2000s, they were about 65 years old. Now, it's the same story with Fox. The demos keep drifting northward. And so the people that are strongly responding to that Trumpian current message tend to be older, they tend to be whiter, they tend to be much more driven by television news. And so, we're seeing a party that has burned its bridges with millennials. We're seeing a party that has burned its bridges with African Americans and Hispanics, probably in a sort of on the Hispanic front, in a way that we haven't even reckoned with yet. And the upcoming pool of voters is not showing the behavior that used to occur in voting populations, which as they got older, they got more conservative. We're not seeing that right now. We're also seeing an element of the Republican Party where Republicans were able to hold on in a few places in the country that on paper should have probably gone to Democrats, but Northern Virginia suburbs, Philly suburbs, et cetera. But in a lot of those places, they've lost a very, very important demographic, and that is college-educated people. And the other demographic they're losing in almost real time, you can almost watch the numbers poll to poll drift down, is women. Republican women are running away from the party as fast as they can. They do not like Donald Trump. Part of it's an aesthetic choice. Part of it's a decency choice. But, I don't know if you're a Republican and you're not just in the business of making excuses, you're not comfortable watching, kids in cages. You're not comfortable seeing kids torn away from their moms. You respond to that on a visceral level. A lot of women voters respond to issues about families on a visceral level. And so this sense of shock and terror that was played out on television for several weeks on the border situation did not accrue to the benefit of the GOP with women at all. And Trump, as he's further exposed as a high or low grade sexual predator and scumbucket, I think he's going to have, it becomes increasingly difficult for women to say, yeah, that's the kind of man I want my kids to act like. That's right. The kind. There's a role model for my kids. I don't think you're going to hear that very much. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point too, because and that's not talked about a whole lot, but we supposedly we learn from the adults, we learn from our elders, we learn from those in higher positions, and boy, oh boy, you don't want your kid learning that. Hey, Rick, some critics of the Never Trump movement say its members should leave the party. How do you respond?
Well, here's the thing. Last time I checked, the membership of the party is still open to people with a brain and guts and a heart, and if I have to put too fine a point on it, I'm willing to help break it if I have to rebuild it, because I do think that there right now is not another option for people who believe in limited government and constitutional fealty and fiscal discipline. Although I will say for the Democrats, one of the biggest opportunities the Democrats have right now to capture an enormous number of sensible people is to put on the fiscal discipline hat, because Donald Trump and this Congress have spent money like drunken sailors. They've engineered a tax bill. And look, I am a low tax guy. I think taxes have traditionally been too high and too punitive and all this other stuff. But this tax bill was engineered by hedge fund managers to pay off other hedge fund managers and to do exactly what it's done, which is to let corporations do gigantic stock buybacks and reward their executives for it. I know this to be a fact because one of the people that wrote the tax bill is a tax lobbyist friend of mine who sat in McConnell's office and wrote this bill. And, they do what they do, and God bless them, but it is a recipe for fiscal disaster. And I think there's a market opportunity for the Democrats if they're at some point adopt a less fruitless approach, because right now the Republicans have completely abandoned the field when it comes to fiscal probity of any kind.
Mm-hmm. Your book, Everything Trump Touches Dies, is this a book you hope Democrats will read as well as Republicans?
I do hope Democrats will read it also, for two reasons. One, there's actually a chapter directed to the Democrats, sort of a "That's Why You Got Trump" chapter, with a little bit of strong medicine to talk about how they need to sort of reboot some of the ways they do campaigns and do politics, because the Democrats over the last 10 years, and it's not just gerrymandering, they've lost 1,000 seats. And a lot of it was because they got disconnected culturally. They started relying on some fairly narrow band tactics, and guys like me were able to come around and skunk up a bunch of Democratic seats that by rights should have been in the hands of the other party. But I hope they'll read it, and I also hope they'll read it with an understanding of just how far Trump is a deviant from conservative principles, and just how far Trump is set aside all the cliches that both parties like to deploy against each other. Trump is sui generis, and Trump is a character who presents enormous dangers to this country, in part because he represents something so different and so wrong that's outside the political guardrails of both parties. I mean, the Democrats have not had the positional power to take on Donald Trump in a lot of ways, and they've lacked sort of the political celebrity power of any individual to come up against him.
How concerned?
The truth is that the superstar of the Democratic Party of the last 50 years has obviously been Barack Obama. And
right.
He's remained largely silent and largely on the sidelines for propriety reasons. As a former president, I know he doesn't want to get into the immediate scrum of everyday politics. But in all these cases, there's a huge celebrity deficit, and it's hard to beat a celebrity messaging unless you've got people who are equally adept at the environment of television and the environment of celebrity politics right now. I mean, Avenatti scares the hell out of him because the guy's just got mad skills all the time.
How concerned are you that Trump could get reelected?
Oh, yeah, I'm very concerned. There's a very good chance Trump gets reelected because, here's some tough talk and real talk. The cancer of Bernie Sanders inside the Democratic Party will probably going to make some heads explode here, but Bernie Sanders and his merry band of arsonists, I think arguably cost Hillary Clinton a meaningful amount of support during the election, and I think that there's a temptation to go to the hard Bernie wing, and go with the go full socialist and all that stuff. That temptation will walk them into a trap where Trump will be able to get his base fired up into the stratosphere, and they'll pursue a portfolio of issues that will motivate the Republican base in ways that it won't be a referendum on Trump. And I'll just tell you, if this turns out to be, if the Democratic nominee is, say, Kamala Harris, this will be a race about the Second Amendment, and the Democrats will lose. They'll just lose. It doesn't matter if you believe in gun control or you don't. It's the political vector of that issue. When there's a horrifying mass shooting, everyone screams and goes, "Oh my God, it has to change." It doesn't change. And then the political disconnect on that issue alone is one that you guys will end up winning 6 states, and Trump will scooch another win if you're not very careful about that issue. And I know what the polls say, but I've seen it 100 times in races from county commissioners to governors, and when you break on that issue, you give the Republican Party the one thing they need, which is a motivating, rally around the flag issue that is, a visceral, emotional red line issue for them. And they care about it in ways the Democrats don't care about any other single issue. Maybe abortion on the Democratic side, but it is a white hot thing. And if it becomes the issue in 2020, I think Trump has a good chance of being reelected. Now, of course, that all controls for externalities. And, that's all with the presumption that Robert Mueller drops dead tomorrow and they lose all the files. There may be plenty more here that change the terrain between now and then. And there may be plenty of other exposures about Trump that make the politics meaningfully different than they are right now. But, we control for what we know. Well, we control for what we know in this case. And like I said, the celebrity question, if I were helping the Democrats select a candidate, candidate quality is incredibly important. It's vital. Getting candidates who can do this work is really important. And sometimes they're right on the policies and they're right on the programmatic stuff, but not good at the work. And if you're not good at politics and good at campaigning and good at speaking and good at media, you need not apply, especially if you're running against a guy who is, for all the hateful shittiness of his whole life, he's good at media. Trump is good at dominating the conversation.
Right. And changing the focus of what should be discussed.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a long set of criteria you want in a candidate. But skill with the media is the modern criteria. It's the must-have of the 2000 teens.
Okay. Rick Wilson, Republican political strategist, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. He's the author of Everything Trump Touches, Everything Trump Touches Dies, a Republican strategist gets real about the worst president ever. Rick, thank you so much for your time with us today. We do appreciate it and look forward to hearing back from you again down the road.
You're very welcome. I appreciate it. Great conversation. Talk to you soon.
And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with NBC political reporter Alex Seitz-Wald about Andrew Gillum's upset victory in Florida and other primary news.
Donald Trump has a new idea. Let's investigate Hillary's emails. Yeah, he tweeted that out at midnight last night. Give it up, Donald. What do you say? Hello, everybody. On a Wednesday, August 29, here we go, the Bill Press Show. Good to have you with us. Coming to you live from Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, right here on Capitol Hill. And in studio with us from NBC News, Alex Seitz-Wald, political reporter. A big day yesterday with the big primaries in Arizona and Florida. Yes, there are still primaries, and there's one more big one to go in New York. Right. September 13, I believe, Alex, right?
Sounds right. I'm going to go with that.
All right. Good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
The big news, I'm going to have, this is unusual now, but I'm going to turn to Chris Christie to tell us the significance of what happened in Florida last night.
On the Democratic side, you can see there's no doubt that the Bernie Sanders wing of the party may have lost the presidential nomination in 2016 to Hillary Clinton, but they have never stopped running and pushing. And in the aftermath of Clinton's defeat by Donald Trump, they are even more energized than ever.
He's dead on. Chris Christie nailed it.
There it is, right? Yeah. And he's, of course, talking about the surprise victory of Andrew Gillum, mayor of Tallahassee. I saw him this morning on not on Fox, but on MSNBC and on CNN. Haven't seen him before, haven't heard him before, but where'd he come from?
Yeah, I think a lot of people were not really paying attention to him because not a single poll had him leading in this race. We were sure that Gwen Graham was going to win this. She's a more moderate former congresswoman. But Andrew Gillum is a really compelling biography. He's a 39-year-old African-American, youngest person ever elected to the Tallahassee City Council. He was the mayor of Tallahassee now. He's the son of a bus driver and a construction worker, one of 7 kids, first in his family to go to college. And he's been one of these people that, for people who have known him or encountered him, I've been hearing his name for years. Everyone's saying he's going to be the next big thing. He's going to be president one day. But people thought that this was a little bit too quick of a jump to go from mayor of Tallahassee to governor of Florida, a giant state. Maybe he'd have to do something in between, but he pulled it out.
Yeah. And on the money side, vastly outspent.
Yeah. So he was running against 2 billionaires, literally, who self-funded their own campaign. Gwen Graham, who had a ton of money, the quote-unquote establishment support. And he got, absolutely, completely outspent. He did have some help from outside groups. Tom Steyer, was backing him. George Soros also was backing him. And now there's going to be a big question about whether he can raise the money in the general election, because Florida is super expensive. But, he put together a coalition that includes Bernie Sanders people, and Bernie Sanders was there earlier this month. People of color, which is a big piece of the coalition that Bernie Sanders didn't have in 2016. And you add a couple of billionaires to that mix, Tom Steyer, George Soros, and you get a really potent coalition, plus a compelling biography, strong progressive platform in this year, and that was the recipe for success.
And it was just a month or so ago, there were a lot of stories about, the Bernie people are taking the party, Democratic Party, too far to the left, and they can never win on this platform. Now, Andrew Gillum's platform was Medicare for all, abolish ICE, impeach Donald Trump. I mean, can't get any farther left, right?
Right.
And he wins the Democratic primary. Is he too far the left for Florida?
Well, there's going to be a lot of people who are saying that. Certainly Ron DeSantis, his Republican opponent who won a primary last night, is saying that.
The ultimate Trumper, Ron DeSantis.
Right. And there's going to be, you're going to hear a lot of concern about that, even from Florida Democrats who say this is a 50-50 state. Of course, Gillum's strategy is going to be, like we've seen with Stacey Abrams in Georgia or lots of these races, not worry so much about trying to win over this thin sliver of undecideds or soft Republicans in the middle, but galvanize the base. I mean, there's a ton of people in Florida who look like they should be Democrats but just don't turn out to vote for one reason or another. He won this primary in part by turning those people out, just like Stacey Abrams did in her race. So if he can do that in the general election, that's his path
to really
to
motivate the base, right? And Andrew Gillum last night, the sound here is not that great. No, not our fault. Wherever he was speaking,
couldn't afford a proper PA system.
Yeah, right.
Underfunded.
That's probably what it is. But here he is saying, he's going to reach out to everybody in Florida whether they voted for him or not.
Those of us who voted for me, those who did not vote at all, those who couldn't vote for me because they may be Republicans. But you want to know something? I want to be their governor too. Right?
And I should point out, he's a Bernie bro. Senator Sanders was down there supporting him. And I saw that Our Revolution was taking a lot of credit for the win, which they rightfully can. This morning. Now, in terms, Alex, looking ahead of governor's races, I mean, I think these are going to be, we pay so much attention to Senate races and House races, right? But look at governor's races. You mentioned Stacey Abrams in Georgia, right? Ben Jealous in Maryland. Andrew Gillum in Florida. Gavin Newsom, not such a tough contest, but still very significant, California. Jared Polis in Colorado, they're just the ones that pop into my head. I mean, these are going to be some of the most important and some of the most exciting races in the country.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we perennially undercover these races, which are hugely important. And I think progressives especially have kind of abdicated state-level races to focus more on federal ones. But on the first three you mentioned
Not now.
Not now, right?
Yeah.
Just an incredible, historically, we've had, I believe, 2 black governors in the entire history of this country, and you now have 3 running this year, Ben Jealous, Stacey Abrams, and Andrew Gillum. So, in both Stacey Abrams' case, Georgia, and in Andrew Gillum's in Florida, right next to each other, you have just an incredible contrast on the ballot in November. They're both running against diehard Trump Republicans. This guy in Florida who won last night, Ron DeSantis, he basically won exclusively because he had the backing of Donald Trump.
Right.
He ran against this Republican guy, Adam Putnam, who had done what you were supposed to do. He was the quote-unquote perfect candidate in the old model, but then Donald Trump took over the party, backed Ron DeSantis because DeSantis would go on Fox News and defend him from the Russia witch hunt, quote-unquote, all the time. And DeSantis won. So you now have 2 39-year-old guys in Florida who represent kind of the beating heart of their base where they are today. A black Bernie Sanders-backed progressive Democrat and a congressman who is just owes his career to Donald Trump.
You could not have a more classic contest fitting today's political landscape than Ron DeSantis versus Andy Gillum.
Right. And it's in a race that is Florida's already the most expensive governor's race in the history of this country.
Really? Yeah.
And I there's going to be a lot more spent in there. So this is going to be a real titanic clash between these 2 guys.
Yeah. One thing that I was thinking about this morning, I don't know. Do you know whether Senator Sanders supported Stacey Abrams in Georgia?
He did.
He did. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So then it even further makes the case, the point I was going to make is that one of the big criticisms of Bernie in 2016, as we remember, and you covered him almost exclusively, is that he had not reached out to, didn't have any ties with, didn't have any roots with, didn't have any identification with the African American community.
Yeah.
Which was a legitimate criticism at the time.
Very legitimate, yeah.
Yeah. Not entirely, but because he had been arrested and marched in the civil rights movement in the South, but people didn't know that. And he
didn't like to talk about it.
Right, not part of his natural constituency, if you will. And yet here's Bernie Sanders supporting 3 African Americans against the Democratic establishment in Georgia, in Florida, and in Maryland, and winning. All 3 of them.
And I think it really points to the future of the kind of progressive movement, the Sanders movement, which is that was the missing piece for Sanders in 2016 was people of color. So if you it took him a while, but he got there. He had trouble seeing what is derisively called identity politics, but you might call intersectionality or whatnot. He tends to view things through an economic lens, not through a racial lens, and he had difficulty seeing the racial lens. But if you can combine both of those, so then you end up with a coalition that includes people of color and white progressives, the typical what you think of as Bernie Bros. That is a really powerful coalition. I think that's a winning coalition, and maybe can take the movement beyond just the normal Bernie Sanders base.
Right, and then there's Arizona, right? We love this. Is maybe our favorite soundbite of the day. So the race in Arizona is to determine who will succeed Jeff Flake in the United States Senate. The big question is, what if Jeff Flake were running for re-election? Here he is, outspoken critic of Donald Trump. What do you say, Senator Flake? He was asked this yesterday. Senator Flake, if you were running for re-election, do you think you could win?
Not a chance today. That won't always be the case, but it is today. This is the president's party, much to my consternation, and I think for the long-term detriment of the party.
No spin, pretty honest, huh?
Fact check true. I mean, yeah, that is dead on. And then he decided not to run for re-election because he is not welcome in Donald Trump's Republican Party anymore. He endorsed Martha McSally, who won last night, who is a sort of more establishment Republican, but she has positioned herself. She had to move way to the right into Trump's lane to win. So Flake endorsed her, and my colleague asked her about this yesterday. Do you think Flake has done a good job for Arizona? And she just completely rejected the endorsement out of hand, so much so that Donald Trump, either early this morning or late last night, tweeted Go Martha McSally. Good job rejecting Jeff
I
Flake.
saw that tweet, which kind of surprised me because Trump had not endorsed her.
Right.
In fact, Kelly Ward was more his kind of a Republican, I believe. The
right.
State senator. And then, of course, there was the famous
Joe Arpaio.
And yet Martha McSally and Trump right away kind of jumping on. So it's Martha McSally and Kyrsten Sinema. Kyrsten Sinema so far has had sort of a free ride there, right, in the Democratic primary. How's that stack up, do you think? I mean,
well, I saw somebody tweet last night, which I think is really right on, that you're going to have two congresswomen running for Senate pretending that their past positions were not their own. So Sinema was a pretty progressive member of Congress who is now moved way to the center to try to win Arizona, obviously a Republican state, hasn't elected a Democrat to the Senate since 1988, I believe. And McSally is a reasonably moderate, kind of down the line Republican who has now moved full Trumpy, who is going to pretend that her past support for more reasonable things is not true
is
either.
Arizona, I don't think of Arizona even as purple. Is it? I mean,
it's trending that way really quick. I mean, so Hillary Clinton came within 4 points, less than 4 points. I just looked at the margin last night. It was like 3.6%. Of Donald Trump, which is way closer than Iowa or Ohio or a lot of these states that we think of as actual swing states. So on paper, it looks like it could be winnable. We just don't know because these are new dynamic, a really energized Latino population, thanks in large part to Joe Arpaio. We don't know if they're going to turn out in a midterm election or if they're more presidential voters. We just really don't know what the electorate is going to look like. But Democrats feel like after Nevada with Dean Heller, where they feel really confident about knocking off Republican Senator Dean Heller there, Arizona is probably their next best senatorial pickup opportunity, followed by Tennessee. But it shows you how terrible the Senate map is for Democrats, that Arizona and Tennessee are what they're getting excited about.
But you touched on something which I think is really maybe will end up being the story of these midterms, and that is turnout.
Yeah.
And enthusiasm. And the enthusiasm gap, right, or the advantage, I should say, is really no doubt on the Democratic side.
Right. And we've seen that in special elections. We've seen that in polling. We've seen that in fundraising. Like any metric you look at, it's clear. They have to fight the pre-existing headwind that Democrats tend not to turn out in midterm elections. I mean, this is true forever. So all of our assumptions about what a midterm election should look like are based on that model, that Republicans turn out more reliably and Democrats don't. But if you get a big bump in Democratic turnout, you can upset that model and unexpected things can happen, like a 39-year-old black mayor of Tallahassee winning a Democratic primary in Florida. So that's really the Democratic plan this year, but it's a little bit of capturing lightning in a bottle. They're fired up now, but who knows what's going to happen in the last 6 weeks of this election. And so that's why in a state like Arizona, where you don't know because these are new dynamics, it's going to be tough to really predict. Even though Sinema is ahead in polls right now.
Alex Seitz-Wald with us from NBC News. It's NBCnews.com. Now, I don't know whether you were out in Chicago over the weekend, but the Democratic Party had the Democratic National Committee. It's a summer meeting of 2018 in Chicago, historic meeting with some major new reforms adopted, which they've been considering ever since the National Convention in 2016. Pretty impressive win for the reformers.
It took a long time, but they got there. Yeah, this is big, and it is historic. The Democratic National Committee has decided for 2020 to essentially eliminate the power of superdelegates, which are those delegates who can vote for whomever they want, regardless of how their state went. They also made a bunch of reforms to caucuses and a number of other things. The whole point was to try to make the process more inclusive, welcome people into the party instead of shutting them out. Very much a response to critiques from Bernie Sanders and his supporters. And, this has been going on for a long time. A lot of people have thought superdelegates were wrong. So, but the big takeaway, superdelegates will not vote on the first ballot in the convention, which sounds wonky, but it's actually pretty simple. It basically means they don't vote unless the convention deadlocks, which hasn't happened since 1952, and you get, a kind of brokered convention. But that at that point, none of the delegates are pledged to anything, and you just have a full-on free-for-all. So this basically eliminates the power of superdelegates. Big change.
A huge change, and we remember in 2016 how many of the superdelegates pledged to Hillary even before she announced she was going to run, and it really either for real, I believe, or certainly gave the impression, right, that the system was rigged in Hillary's, and it was not a fair and level playing field.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's no question it's undemocratic, small d democratic, and that it was intentionally set up that way. The process was
to prevent the crazies from taking over.
Exactly. Yeah, it was created in the 80s specifically to put an institutional check on the base. But because of 2016, there is now a serious perception problem, and some people would say, real problem, that your vote doesn't matter, that the small group of party insiders can overturn the will of the people. It's never happened where the superdelegates have gone against the results of the primaries and caucuses, but the fact that it could happen, and just the way that it kind of influences the process less concretely, with a bunch of them coming out early and therefore showing huge momentum for Hillary Clinton among superdelegates. All of that has contributed to this sense among a lot of people, not just Bernie Sanders supporters, that this is a system that is unfair, it suppresses energy, and has to go.
Chairman Tom Perez was our guest yesterday, sitting right where you are at this very hour. And there were a lot of people, a lot of Democrats, particularly Bernie supporters, who felt Tom Perez is never going to support this. He's the enemy. Of course, he ran against Keith Ellison for chair, but there were some people after the vote last weekend, right, who had to say, well, finally, we can say some good things about Tom Perez.
Yeah, it was an odd coalition of Bernie Sanders supporters and Tom Perez, and a lot of Hillary Clinton supporters. And the main opposition came from it was generational, and it was partially racial too. It was old guard Democrats, people who've been around for a long time, and especially black delegates who've been around for a long time.
Why?
They remember Jesse Jackson and being kicked out of the convention and feeling like the party was run by a smoke-filled room of white older men, and that they fought for this right to get this power to guarantee that there would be representation for people of color inside the Democratic National Convention. The CBC came out against this strongly. Younger, I overheard this conversation specifically. One older black delegate said, I remember Jesse Jackson. A younger black delegate said, I remember Michael Brown, and I remember feeling like my institutions don't represent me. So younger black members were more in favor of this charge, more or less. In the end, the opponents decided not to take a vote, so we don't actually know their numbers, but it was pretty clear that they were overwhelmingly outnumbered. But your point about Tom Perez, I think the whole point of this was to reclaim legitimacy for the Democratic Party, and that includes Tom Perez. And he's been beat up a lot since he took that job. Especially from the left, from Bernie Sanders people. So now he has something that he can go to them and say, "Look, we're listening to you. We're responding to your concerns. Stick with us. I know you're frustrated, but we're making it better."
Plus, I think these are absolutely necessary reforms to make, as I argued passionately myself, to make the Democratic Party more democratic.
Yeah.
And I don't believe the caucuses are democratic with a small d. The closed primaries are not democratic with a small d. And certainly letting the superdelegates ignore the will of the people of their state just because they happen to be party poobahs, I think is clearly not democratic. So I think these are great moves, important moves.
There's an interesting political science debate that's been happening around this, where political scientists say parties need to be gatekeepers to prevent the crazies, as you put it, from taking over, and so that there's some concern about this. But I think the more pressing threat to the party was its legitimacy for its own base and for people who are aligned with it, and this was something that they had to do. The whole thing where you always hear Clinton people say, "Well, Bernie Sanders isn't a Democrat, therefore he shouldn't be in here." Right. It's like reinforcing the boundaries of where the party begins and ends. And I think this argument is, no, we want to open those boundaries. We want to bring people into the party. Because if you look at registrations, especially among young people, there's a lot of young people who agree with the policies of the Democratic Party, but they don't like it institutionally, and so they're registering as independents. And that's a huge generation that could be a huge political boon for Democrats, but you need to have a path for those people to come into the party.
I have to tell you, just a little personal aside, you and I were both there at the DNC meeting in the summer of 2016 when, I think it was 2016, maybe it was 2015, when all 5 Democratic candidates at the time, Link Chafee, Jim Webb, Bernie Sanders, Hillary,
Martin
O'Malley, thank you, right, spoke to the DNC.
Yeah.
And so as former Democratic State Chair of California, as a former member of the DNC, I was there as a reporter now, but these are all I sat with the California delegations, I guess, that I used to be a member of.
Yeah.
And I looked around and I realized, and I'd been gone 20 years, that all the other people there were the same people who were there 20 years before. And I just said to myself, holy crap, this party really needs a kick in the ass. This party really needs some reform.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not good for the party. The same people I served with 20 years ago are all still members of the DNC. Hadn't evolved kind of at all. And I think that was true of many states.
Well, on that, it's just a really interesting note how many people who are in this room in Chicago on this reform process who had been there in the last reform process in the 80s who created superdelegates, and now we're turning around and undoing it.
Yeah.
Same people.
By the way, after Tom Perez left here yesterday, there was a bomb threat at the DNC. Just for the record, I want to know we had nothing to do with that. But Peter, at least it was a crank call, I guess it turned out to be, but still pretty scary when that happens.
Yeah, they evacuated the building. You don't want to take a risk with that.
No, exactly. And that was on top of another attempt to hack them, which Tom Perez told us about yesterday. They'd put some protections in place, and that hacking was not successful this time around, at least. Alex Seitz-Wald stays with us as a friend of Bill here, and we'll be joined by Simone Pathé from Roll Call, senior political reporter. More on the political scene and the landscape today, which has changed dramatically after yesterday's primaries.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible, Rick Wilson and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.